Hello, it's Christopher Nickel with you here, and today I want to talk about curves. Curves is an adjustment layer that allows you to adjust the tone, the contrast, and the color balance of your photographs. It is one of the most useful and powerful tools in all of Photoshop, and once you learn it, you'll find that you use it on almost every single image that you edit. Now, to begin with, curves is an adjustment layer, and if you apply it correctly, it is non-destructive, meaning that any adjustments that you make using this adjustment layer can be undone, can be revised, can be continuously changed into the future, and doesn't make any permanent alterations to the pixels in the original photograph. To begin using curves, I find my way to the bottom of my layers panel, and I'm actually going to move this up in my workspace so that you can see it more clearly. At the bottom of my layers panel, you'll see the half and half circle that allows you to add a new adjustment layer, and about a third of the way down you will see the word curves on the menu. When I click that, a new layer is automatically created. And again, this is the fundamental property of all non-destructive tools. When you create that new curves layer, what you will see first is a new properties window opens up. And in the properties, you should recognize immediately the main content of the window, which is a histogram. And again, a histogram is a map of all the tones in the image. Starting on the left with black and proceeding all the way up to the right with white, you see how many pixels within the image are present for every single tone. Now, with curves, it's vital to really understand what you're looking at when you're looking at this histogram. And this is laid out in a very particular way, which makes it very easy to use for the purposes that we'll be using it. In the far lower left, this quadrant represents the shadow tones of the image. Towards the middle of this graph, these are the middle tones. You have the darker middle tones and lighter middle tones here. And then finally, in the far right-hand column, you have the highlights. Now, fundamentally, the curves adjustment, it works similarly to levels in that you have a black point and a white point, and you can slide those in order to adjust exactly which tones are pure black and which tones are pure white, and then repositioning all the tones in between accordingly. So by sliding the white in and the black in towards one another, you can see I can immediately increase the contrast of the image. Down at the bottom of this panel, you'll see I have a curved arrow with a line underneath that, and I'll be using this a couple times throughout this demonstration in order to reset the work that I've done. As I mentioned at the beginning, curves is the most useful tool for adjusting tone and contrast. So I want to start there with you. Now, once again, this middle part of the graph is the midtones. And if I come in here and click at the center of this line that runs diagonally, I actually create what's called an anchor point, which I then can click and hold on and slide up and down in order to adjust the overall tonality of the image. And you can see as I go up, it gets lighter. As I go down, it gets darker. I'll go back to the original and let you know what I'm looking at when I'm doing this. When I first open a photograph, I like to do a quick assessment of what the photograph is versus what I think it should be. This image feels very drab and dreary to me, which indicates partially that the image is too dark overall. So that's why I think that we need to go in and right off the bat make an anchor point in the midtones and raise the tonality. This image is particularly useful for this because there's a lot of tones in here, this concrete ground and the concrete buildings, that should be a midtone, so I have a useful place to gauge that. The way that this works is that the bar across the bottom from black to white represents the tones as they are in the original image. There's a similar bar that goes vertically from black to white, and that is the way the tones will be after you make adjustments in the curves. So as you can see, since it goes from black at the bottom to white on the top, as you bend that curve upwards, things get lighter. As you bend it downwards, things get darker. And that that change in tonality corresponds to this vertical bar right here. You'll see as I raise the tonality of the midtones, one of the things that I think is happening is that I feel like the dark tones now are not dark and rich enough as I would like them to be. So what I can then do is come over here to the shadows portion of the histogram. I can make a new anchor point and I can pull that down until I feel like the darks are rich, they are dark, the very darkest tones are black, but I'm not losing detail in the blacks. And if I zoom in here, I can look in at some of the pedestrians here and take a close look at all these black jackets that are here. And if I bring this too far down, you'll see that I start losing detail. I start losing those folds and wrinkles and zippers and little details in those jackets. So what I'm looking for is a point at which the darkest points are black, but I still have good detail, texture, and tonality in those dark areas. Likewise, I want to now take a look at adjusting the lighter areas. And obviously the sky here is the lightest portion of the frame for me. And you can see as I move it down, I all of a sudden start getting some definition in the clouds, whereas if I move it up, it just becomes white and blown out. So I might bring this down a little bit closer to where it was, just so I see a little bit of the cloud in the sky there. So with this change in my curve, I've lightened the overall tone, and now you can see that it's a little bit brighter. It has some nice contrast to it. When you make the darks lower than the midtones, you increase contrast, and it feels like a little bit more dynamic in images as a result. At the bottom of your properties panel, you'll see there's an eyeball, and that does allow you to see the image without the curve applied and then with the curve applied. So that will help you gauge the quality of your work. So this curve adjusts my tone and my contrast here. So I've managed to accomplish both using this tool. You will find that with almost every image, you will make 3 anchor points here in order to make these adjustments between tone and contrast. And that was 1 anchor point for your shadows, 1 for your midtones, and 1 for your highlights. It is rare that you will need more. One of the things that you want to accomplish in the way that you adjust your tones is to have a nice smooth curve. If you make too dramatic a change and you start getting into a weird kind of shape here with your tones, you'll find that the tones in your image start to look a little bit off. So you don't want to overdo it here. You really do want to make sure to make your adjustments be a little bit more subtle, and that the tone curve that you're creating isn't too distorted, it's not too twisted. It is kind of a nice smooth bump. Very often you'll end up making what's called an S-curve, which has a high highlight and a low shadow point, and that's a way of increasing the contrast in your image. This shape is called an S-curve. I'm not sure it's appropriate for this image, and this is an important takeaway here, that each image requires its own set of adjustments, so there's not one universal that you can apply that's perfect for everything. Now, I'm just going to back up 1 step here to show you guys a couple more of the options here within curves. You'll see there's a drop-down menu next to the word preset here. And this actually gives you a number of different adjustments to the tone and contrast. Options that are just done for you in advance. So you can see there's darker, increased contrast, lighter, and you can see how that impacts the curve, where Photoshop has decided to put the default anchor points, how they're being adjusted, and it gives you a little bit of a place to start your own consideration. As a skilled user of Photoshop, I think that you should always do this manually. Once you get comfortable with it, you'll find that it's a very quick process to make the adjustments that you want, and you're going to be much more precise than a preset is going to be for your image because you know what your image should look like. Photoshop doesn't. Those are just kind of all-purpose applications that are not necessarily right for you. Okay, so once I'm done with that, I'm actually going to name my layer Tone and Contrast, because I want to know what that curve does. When you are doing really thorough editing, you're really doing something comprehensive and complex to your image, you may end up with many curves layers. I mean, I've seen images with more than a dozen curves layers applied to them, and we'll get into that in another video, exactly why you would do that. But it's good to know which curves layer is doing what, is adjusting what. So I like to name mine as I move along. So as I mentioned in the beginning, not only is curves the best tool to adjust tone and contrast, but it is also the best tool for adjusting overall color balance. So you'll see I actually came down and I made a second curves layer, and you'll see another curves adjustment layer there in my layers panel. And this one looks a little different, oddly enough. This one has these odd vertical stripes going through the histogram. The reason for that is that this curves layer and the histogram that's being demonstrated is also accounting for the alterations that I made in the curve below it. So this histogram is not just looking at the original picture, it's looking at the original picture and this curve. Since I made changes to the tonalities, Photoshop had to stretch and push the tones in the image to get them to do what I wanted to, and that's being reflected in this kind of choppier histogram. This should immediately make you recognize that you don't want to overdo curves adjustments, because when you start breaking apart the tone curve too much, again, you stop having smooth tonal gradations, you'll start seeing some banding. It can be problematic for the overall quality of your image in the long term. So again, try to be subtle. Now, when we were making these adjustments initially to the tone and contrast, I was using this drop-down menu set to RGB. So this image is in the red, green, blue color mode, and when I have this drop-down menu selected to RGB, I'm affecting all of the colors at once, which basically means the overall tonality of the image. I'm making all colors brighter and darker. That means I'm making the whole image brighter and darker. However, when I click on that drop-down menu, you will see I can actually select just one of the color channels, red, green, or blue. When I select one of those, now instead of affecting all the tones in the image, I am just affecting one of the colors in the image. And when you are affecting one of the colors, you're actually affecting two. You're affecting that color and its inverse. So if you can remember the CMYK color wheel, red is the opposite of cyan, green is the opposite of red, green is the opposite of magenta, and blue is the opposite of yellow. So with the red one selected, if I bring that up, I make the whole image more red. If I bring it down, I make the whole image more of its opposite, which is cyan. Same is true with green, where again I can increase the green in the image, or I can decrease the green in the image, which is making it more, again, magenta. Now, one of the most difficult things that you'll run into is not making the adjustments, but identifying which adjustments need to be made. This is a skill that takes practice and feedback as you work on it, so don't get frustrated if you're not seeing this right off the bat. One of the best places to start is the image neutral? Is it cool, or is it warm? Neutral is it looks the way the color should look in the world. Cool means it is casted by a certain color that's on the cooler side of the spectrum, meaning cyan, green, or blue. Or if it's warm, it's going to be casted by one of the warmer colors in the spectrum, red, magenta, or yellow. In this case, I look at this image, it looks like a cold day, everybody's wearing these heavy jackets, but in addition to that, the coloring of it feels very, very cool. So now that I've identified it as a cool image, I can narrow it down to either it's cyan, green, or blue. And looking at it, I feel like it's probably mostly cyan. Cyan, is close to a turquoise, which is a more common word for that. So cyan is the opposite of red. So if I bring the red histogram up and I start increasing it, you'll see it's warming the image. It's making the tones a little bit warmer. Now, I can go to a point where I've clearly overdone it, and I can just back up, dropping that curve down until I feel like I've gotten to a point that is relatively neutral. Maybe a little lower. And you'll see that the change that I've made is actually pretty subtle. I'm not making some huge curvy alteration to the line there. It's actually a pretty subtle one. Down at the bottom of your properties panel, you also have the ability to just look past your previous change. So as I do that, if I go back to what it was, you should immediately see how cold the original image was, how cyan it was, and how much better it is now. Now I'm going to undo that curve by going back to the reset to show you a couple of useful sort of shortcuts that you can find here. Over on the left-hand side, you will see 3 eyedroppers, and they are black, gray, and white. And these set your black point, your gray point, or your white point, basically meaning you can select a tone in that area and it will do its best, Photoshop will, to make that tone neutral. So depending on the type of image you have, if you have one that's predominantly dark tones, you'd use the black point. If you have one that's predominantly light tones, you'd use the white point. But in this case, we have lots and lots of gray tones that I think should be neutral, and so it will do it for me. So if I take this gray dropper and just click somewhere in the image that I think should be a neutral gray, you'll see it will automatically make tonal adjustments for me. It did not do much in that case, but let's try another gray. There we go. So I can click around in the image and try to select a gray that gives me the results that I'm looking for in terms of creating a nicely neutral image. So you can see it chose to do something a little bit more complicated than what I did manually. So it raised the red a little bit. It kept the green more or less the same, but it dropped the blue, meaning it added yellow to the picture. And that's actually pretty good. That gives me a pretty neutral place to start. If I still feel like more adjustments are necessary after using this kind of automatic feature, I can come in and I can make manual adjustments on top of that by grabbing the anchor points that Photoshop created automatically. The goal here, again, is to create as neutral looking an image as possible. To judge this, there's kind of a step of priorities that I use. I think first and most importantly, if you have a picture that has a large portion of the frame taken up by a human being, try to make their skin tone look correct. Sometimes that's difficult to judge if it's somebody that you haven't met before, but I think we all have a sense of what natural, healthy-looking skin tone is, and you can come in and adjust your colors in order to achieve that. Secondly, look for a neutral tone in the image. Concrete is the best. Concrete or some sort of a cool metal like steel or aluminum, if you see either of those in the image, you can aim to make that a neutral gray, and that's going to give you the most effective place to judge whether or not you have a color cast to your image or not. Now, lastly, you can look for kind of overall environmental clues. The sky, oftentimes, especially a cloudy sky, is a really great place to see color casts. You can be deceived by skies, though, depending on if it's raining or if the sun's shining through the sky. That can throw the color cast off, so be aware of that. But there's always places to look in order to make these adjustments. Once again, I'm going to come in, I'm going to rename this color, and you can see now with these two curves adjustment layers, I've managed to address both the tone and contrast and the color of the image. By turning those on, you can see what a significant improvement I've made in the natural look of the image. That's the before, that's the after, and you should be able to do that to all of your pictures. Contemporary digital cameras do a pretty good job of trying to gauge appropriate exposure to create the appropriate tone, to set the white balance automatically to achieve the appropriate color balance, but they are not perfect. I've never seen an image that is perfect right out of the camera. Almost every single almost every single photograph can be improved with some curves adjustments here. You should plan on using curves adjustments to adjust the tone and contrast, as well as the color balance of just about every single photograph you edit. As you can see, once you get some practice at it and you really practice the seeing of the color and the seeing of the tone, you can make these adjustments very quickly. You can be quite nuanced and subtle with those adjustments and make really, really significant improvements really, really quickly. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found this useful. I am Christopher Nickel. Goodbye.